The closer we get to the draft, the clearer it becomes that the Detroit Lions are at a real crossroads in how they want to build this roster. And there's one idea that keeps gaining traction the more you dig into it, a trade down that could quietly reshape everything about this class. Because right now, with less than 3 weeks to go, it's not just about who the Lions pick, it's about how many impact players they can realistically walk away with. And if you've been following the recent patterns, you already know the big concern. Brad Holmes has shown a clear tendency to be aggressive, to move up, to go get his guy. But here's the uncomfortable truth that's starting to settle in. It hasn't consistently worked over the last couple of years. Trading up sounds great in theory, but when you look at roster holes and long-term depth, it can leave you thinner than you want to be. So now flip the mindset for a second. What if instead of moving up, the Lions finally leaned the other way? In a trade down scenario, everything starts to open up. You move off pick 17, and suddenly you're stacking additional assets. Extra picks in that critical middle range where teams often find starters or high-level contributors. And that's where this gets interesting, because this roster doesn't just need one more piece. It likely needs multiple players who can contribute right away. Think about the offensive line first. Even after moving down, there are still quality tackles sitting there in the middle of the first round. One name that stands out in this scenario is Blake Miller, a player who has been compared stylistically to Taylor Decker, but brings a bit more edge, a bit more physicality, and that's the key point here. You're not sacrificing talent, you're just being smarter about where you take it. Now suddenly, instead of just getting your tackle, you're also holding picks in the second and third rounds that you didn't have before. That changes everything, because now you can address the edge position without reaching. Players like Mason Thomas are still available in that range. Guys who can develop into real contributors, especially in a system that values physicality and versatility on the defensive front, and you're not forced into a corner. If one guy goes off the board, there are still options. That flexibility is something this team hasn't always had when trading up. Then comes the real turning point, the extra pick you gained. That's where this strategy really pays off. At that stage, you're no longer drafting out of necessity. You're drafting out of opportunity. Maybe you reinforce the interior offensive line with someone who can transition from tackle to guard. Maybe you look at a dynamic offensive weapon who can complement Jahmyr Gibbs and give this offense another layer. Or maybe you strengthen the defensive interior or secondary. The point is, you have choices and not just one forced decision, and that's what makes this approach so compelling. The Lions don't just need a headline pick. They need 3 players who can either start or play meaningful snaps early. That's how you sustain success. That's how you build a roster that doesn't fall apart when injuries hit or when the schedule gets tough. What really stands out is how quickly the board still works in your favor. Even after trading down, you're still landing a starting caliber tackle. You're still landing an edge defender. And now you've added another potential contributor, all within the first 3 rounds. That's a completely different outcome compared to moving up for a single player. And when you take it even further, stacking multiple mid-round picks gives you something else. Control. You can package them to move back up if a specific player starts to fall, or you can sit back and keep adding depth. Either way, you're dictating the draft instead of reacting to it. So when you really break it down, the trade down scenario isn't just a backup plan. It might actually be the smartest move available to this front office right now. It maximizes value, fills multiple needs, and still keeps the team competitive in the short term while building for the future. The big question is whether the Lions are willing to shift their philosophy when it matters most. Because if they stay aggressive and move up again, they're betting big on one player. But if they move back, they're betting on building a complete roster. And at this stage of the rebuild, are the Lions better off chasing one elite piece or stacking multiple impact players to strengthen the entire foundation? And that's where things start to get even more fascinating. Because once you accept the idea of trading down, you're not just changing one pick, you're changing the entire flow of the draft for the Detroit Lions. Now you're sitting there after landing your offensive tackle, and instead of feeling pressure, you're in control. That's a completely different position compared to recent drafts. You're looking at the board at pick 50, and instead of scrambling to fill a desperate need, you're calmly evaluating value. Edge is still a priority, and the board is still giving you options. That's where a player like Mason Thomas comes into play again. A prospect with traits you can work with, someone who fits what this defense wants to do, especially as a developing presence on the edge. But here's the key difference now. now. You're not forced to take him. You can, but you don't have to, because you know you've got another pick coming up soon, and that's where the flexibility really starts to separate this approach from anything else. That extra selection you gained, whether it's around pick 70 or somewhere in that range, becomes a pivot point for the entire class. This is where teams either panic or get creative, and in this case, creativity is exactly what opens the door for the Lions. You start looking across the board, and suddenly multiple directions make sense. You could double down on the offensive line and bring in someone who projects as a guard at the next level, reinforcing the interior and protecting your investment at tackle. You could shift to defense and address the interior with a powerful presence who can rotate early. Or you could go skill position and add an explosive element to the offense. Someone who complements what you already have and makes life even easier for the quarterback. And this is where the conversation gets real interesting, because now it's not about what do the Lions need most. It's about how many problems can they solve at once. That's a completely different mindset. Even defensively, you start to see how this plays out long term. Instead of relying on one major addition to change the pass rush, you're layering pieces. Maybe you take a developmental edge early, and then later you grab a high upside power end, someone who can set the edge against the run and grow into a larger role. Suddenly you're not depending on one player to carry the load. You're building a rotation, and that matters over a full season. And then you get into day 3, where this strategy really starts to show its full value. Multiple 4th round picks give you options that most teams simply don't have. You can package those picks and move up if there's a player slipping that you love, or you can stay put and keep adding depth across the roster. Offensive line, linebacker, secondary. Every position becomes available without pressure. That's how you build a complete team. Because let's be honest, this roster is good, but it's not perfect. There are still areas that need depth, still spots where competition would elevate the group, and the fastest way to address that isn't by sacrificing picks to move up. It's by giving yourself more swings. More swings means more chances to hit, and that's really what this entire strategy comes down to. The Lions are in a position now where they don't need to force anything. They're not rebuilding from the ground up anymore. They're refining. They're strengthening. They're trying to go from good to complete. So the decision becomes philosophical. Do you trust your scouting enough to find value across multiple rounds, or do you lock in on one player and hope he becomes the difference maker? Because if you look at how the board can fall, if you look at how many solid prospects are still available in that middle range, it becomes harder and harder to justify giving that up. The depth of this class, especially at positions like offensive tackle, works in your favor if you're patient, and patience might be the most important shift of all here. Instead of chasing the draft, you let it come to you. Instead of reacting, you dictate. Instead of betting everything on one move, you build layers into your roster that can sustain success deep into the season. That's the kind of approach that doesn't just win headlines on draft night, it wins games in December and January. So now it all comes down to what this front office truly believes. Are they ready to adjust? Are they ready to take advantage of teams behind them that feel like they're one player away and are willing to overpay to move up? Because if they are, the Lions could walk out of this draft with not just one impact player, but 3, maybe even 4, who can shape this team immediately. If you're looking at this realistically, would you rather see the Lions stay aggressive and go get one specific player, or step back, collect more picks, and build a deeper, more complete roster for a real playoff push? And if you had the final say, which direction are you taking? And that's exactly where the final layer of this conversation comes into focus, because once you really walk through all the scenarios, it stops being just about draft strategy and starts being about identity. If the Lions choose to stay aggressive, move up, and target one specific player, they're sending a very clear message. They believe they are one piece away, one impact player who can tilt the field, who can elevate the roster from contender to something even more dangerous. That approach is bold, it's confident, and it fits the personality we've seen from this front office. But it also comes with risk, because if that one player doesn't hit immediately, or if depth becomes an issue later in the season, you start to feel the consequences of those lost picks. Over a long NFL season, depth isn't optional, it's survival. Now flip it back to the trade down approach and the identity shifts. This becomes a team that is thinking long term while still competing right now. A team that understands the value of depth, of rotation, of having multiple contributors instead of relying too heavily on a few stars. And when you look at how successful teams are built, especially the ones that sustain success year after year, that's usually the formula. Waves of talent, constant competition, players who can step in without the level dropping off. That's what this opportunity in the draft is really offering the Lions. Because with the way the board sets up, with the depth at positions like offensive tackle and the availability of defensive front players in the middle rounds, this is one of those rare situations where moving back doesn't mean missing out. It means doubling down on value. And don't overlook the psychological side of it either. When you bring in multiple rookies who are all capable of contributing, you raise the level of competition across the roster. Veterans feel it, younger players feel it. Every position group gets pushed, and that's how teams take another step forward without necessarily making a blockbuster move. It's also how you protect yourself. Injuries happen, slumps happen, the unexpected always shows up at some point in the season, and when it does, having multiple young players who've already been integrated into the rotation can be the difference between staying on track or falling off. So now, when you zoom out and look at the full picture, the decision becomes even more meaningful. It's not just about the first round, it's about how the Lions want to operate moving forward. Are they going to continue being aggressive at the top of the draft, or are they going to trust their ability to evaluate talent across multiple rounds and build something deeper? Because both paths can work, but they lead to very different outcomes in how this team evolves over the next couple of seasons. And that's why this draft feels so important, not just because of the players involved, but because of what it represents. A shift or a confirmation of philosophy. If they trade down and execute it well, you could be looking at a class that adds a starting tackle, a rotational edge with upside, and another contributor who fills a key role. Maybe even more if they maximize those extra picks. That's how you quietly turn a strong roster into a complete one. If they don't, and they go get their guy, then all eyes will be on that player to justify the move. Either way, this is a defining moment. So now it's your turn. If you're sitting in that draft room knowing everything we just walked through, are you pushing the card in for one player you believe in? Or are you stepping back, collecting those extra picks, and building this team the deeper, smarter way? At this point, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to fully commit to whichever path you believe in, because hesitation on draft night is where teams make mistakes. If the Lions walk into this draft with a clear plan to trade down, then everything we talked about has to be intentional. You're identifying the teams behind you that are desperate